The 1950s was marked in large part by the new leaders that had come to power. As we talked about, Truman and Stalin are both out, Truman having been replaced electorally in 1953 and upon inauguration by Eisenhower, and Stalin, of course, would die in March of 1953. Eisenhower, interestingly enough, as the boy soldier, he was commonly called, was elected in large part to take on Stalin, and of course Stalin would die within a couple months, and we talked briefly about the power struggle that would take place in the Soviet Union, ending with Khrushchev's rise to power. So by 1955, Khrushchev is in power, and he will counter Eisenhower until 1961, when he is replaced via election by JFK. Eisenhower's policies were largely shaped not only by Eisenhower, but by his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles. Both of these men very hawkish, very anti-communist, and they would come out with some new and by some perspectives radical policies. They both feared the changing shape of the world and the landscape, especially of Europe. 1945 had already seen takeover in the Eastern Bloc by the Soviet Union through military occupation. Of course, he had already in World War II in 1941 expanded his borders, and by 1949 he had taken over. He had more satellite states: Poland, Eastern Germany, Romania, Bulgaria. Not to mention that communism had spread by 1949 to China, and then 1953 with the conclusion, or it's not really a conclusion, a truce, the armistice in North Korea between the North and the South, the 38th parallel. So North Korea now falling under the communist umbrella. So they started to be concerned, the United States and specifically John Foster Dulles and Eisenhower, has containment been successful? Is containment too passive? John Foster Dulles introduces some new ideas, saying, "We shall never have a secure peace or happy world so long as Soviet communism dominates 1/3 of all the peoples." Okay, so they advocate this idea of rollback, not just containing communism, but literally reversing communism and taking communism and eliminating communism where communism already existed. Of course, this is a much more radical policy, which, if you think about it, actually involves invasion. So is containment too passive? Both of these leaders seem to think so. Eisenhower would go on to talk about, in various speeches, the liberation of Eastern Europe. He says the liberation and independence of all of these submerged nations is vital to the national security of the United States. Of course, this idea relies on the idea that war wouldn't take place, that the Soviet Union wouldn't defend their satellites, or that they don't match our nuclear capabilities, and all of those things, of course, nullified the effectiveness of any sort of real rollback policy. What actually came to develop in terms of his foreign policy was what became known as the New Look, Eisenhower's New Look foreign policy. It relied heavily on this idea of massive retaliation. Eisenhower was a conservative, first and foremost, and a soldier, of course, and he was concerned about what you see here in quotes, this permanent commitment to military expenditures so vast that it would lead to practical bankruptcy of the United States. He, of course, was concerned about the development of a garrison state, like a country that was so dedicated to military that military would basically take over all other institutions and importance. So he felt that nuclear weapons was a little bit more efficient, more bang for your buck. He says we can actually target the places that need to be targeted. We can deconstruct. This is an important thing to remember. Deconstruct the industrial military complex, these big defense industries that are making bank on all of these conventional weapons, like just the massive expenditure involved in conventional forces. He said, you know what? As fiscal conservative, I think that we can be more effective, get more bang for your buck, with just massive retaliation and reliance on nuclear weapons. The goal, of course, is not just deterring the Soviet Union, but we want victory. Okay, he and John Foster Dulles were in complete agreement on this. Dulles saying we should get maximum protection at bearable cost, which is, of course, now reliance on nuclear weapons. Eisenhower saying we should treat nuclear weapons as conventional weapons and to use them whenever required to achieve national objectives. Think about that for a minute, about the idea that we would use nuclear weapons as if they were just regular bombs. deterrence of massive retaliatory power. Eisenhower talks about the only sensible thing to do is to put all of our resources into hydrogen bombs. Okay, these are kind of scary ideas, and you can imagine the effect that they have having a policy like this, not only in the Soviet Union, but on our society itself. At various times, it is shown that Eisenhower actually considered plans for using nuclear weapons in a wide array of places, including Korea, Vietnam, China, Germany, Yugoslavia, and beyond. He was so obsessed with this idea of being anti-communist, he even said, "I would rather be atomized than communized." He was so worried about the possible infiltration of the Soviet Union into the U.S. sphere. And our sphere is going to begin expanding as we define our national security needs more broadly throughout this period. Going back to that same question again, this idea of mutually assured destruction, like we bomb them, they bomb us, the world blows up, leads to widespread domestic fears. Despite the fact that much of this policy may have a national security component, is also rooted in his interest in domestic policy and fiscal conservatism. Okay, another component of New Look beyond massive retaliation is covert ops. The CIA was a fairly new organization and still sort of trying to find its foothold and its place in American national security. And with the developing world now becoming free, decolonized, there was a lot of opportunity for the United States to form new alliances. So the United States would use the CIA very strategically to go into all sorts of places around the world, including Cuba and Guatemala and Bolivia and the Congo and Iran and a bunch of places that we'll talk about a little bit more. Now, here's the question. Are we combating communism here or nationalism? And at what point do we fail to see the distinction between nationalist movements and communist movements? And what role does our CIA play in politically in having a political influence in those places? Okay. Additionally, the New Look foreign policy relies on alliances, not just NATO, of course, which was the beginning, but ANZUS, which is Australia, New Zealand, the United States, a critical alliance formed in 1951. The United States didn't feel like they could have enough friends. CETO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, formed in 1954. You don't have to know the dates. You don't have to know all the members, but it's good to know a few of these organizations and the way in which the United States sought alliances as a tool, just another tool in the toolbox to combat the spread of communism. The Baghdad Pact, 1955. Now, keep in mind, none of these agreements, the Baghdad Pact, ANZUS, CETO, none of them were quite as effective as the original one, which was NATO, of course, 1949. But all of them did play a critical role in trying to help the United States form alliances to combat subversion, to combat communism around the world. And a lot of them, if you pay attention, some of them really border along Soviet areas, providing a new threat and potential distrust by the Soviet Union. Summits would be critical both to Eisenhower's foreign policy and Khrushchev's outlook once he would come to power in 1955. So this was really important because you didn't have the United States and the Soviet Union sitting down for nearly a decade. It was 1945 in Yalta and then, of course, finally in Potsdam, the last time these two leaders sat at the table. So the fact that Eisenhower and Khrushchev are willing at Geneva twice for different reasons in 54 and then 55, Paris and then Vienna in 60 and then 61 with JFK once he finally comes to power. A lot of scholars don't really believe much of substance came out of these meetings, but I think it is important that they are actually willing to talk to each other and potentially negotiate. And you know, being at the table is half the battle of preventing nuclear war at some point. Khrushchev policies are not all that different. He wants to prop up Eastern Europe and tighten ties. You could argue that it's very similar to the United States' seeking out different alliances. He wants to create buffer states between the opposing blocs and to set up normal relations with NATO countries. And that's going to happen via these summits, via trade. We're going to talk a little about in a minute. Goals for him were settling the East-West differences and reining in the arms race. The arms race for Khrushchev was as problematic as it was for Eisenhower, largely for similar reasons. The domestic implications of the arms race were even worse for Khrushchev, arguably, because there were no consumer goods. The living conditions in the Soviet Union were just dire, and the fact that they were spending so much of their money on an arms race that they, quite honestly, probably were not going to win, right? was not politically desirable for Khrushchev. Khrushchev's policies continued to talk about this idea. He publishes this article called Coexistence, okay, in Foreign Policy in 1959, and he says, you may like your neighbor or dislike him. You are not obliged to be friends with him or visit him, but you live side by side. So what's his point? His point is you have two options. You can either buy into this idea of war, the inevitability of war that Stalin talked about, and that really harkens back to, basic Bolshevik and Marxist ideas about this inevitability of war, which in the era of nuclear arms is getting back to mad. This idea of mutually assured destruction. Is the idea of the inevitability of war a feasible idea now that we have a nuclear arms race emerging? Or is peaceful coexistence something that is actually a political necessity and really a necessity for human survival? Okay, what does peaceful coexistence mean? Well, for Mao, he believed that this was, antithetical to anything that was proper communist or Marxist doctrine. He called it revisionist Marxism. And, a little less than 20 years later, he would rethink that policy as he reached out his hand to the United States in an effort to make peace, and for various reasons that we can discuss at another point. So peaceful coexistence would basically end this idea of spreading revolution, end this idea that the Soviet Union would take an active role in manipulating elections, purging people, fighting counter-revolutionaries, attacking countries, using occupation or rolling in tanks. Like, all of that stuff theoretically would end with the advent of peaceful coexistence. And instead, the Soviet Union planned to lead by example. And in leading by example, they would actually commit themselves in the end to proxy wars, where they were basically supporting one side against another side that was supported by the United States. You would see this often in civil wars, like the Greek Civil War, which was one of the early ones of the Cold War. Also Korea, which we'll talk about, Vietnam, Congo crisis, Bolivia. All of these were examples of proxy wars that were really, part of this, indirectly a part of this peaceful coexistence policy. So are these new countries that are newly decolonized truly independent? Do they really have freedom? Liberalization was another big thing that Khrushchev promoted. And in terms of liberalization, it was going to be less censorship, less repression, less terror, maybe a little bit more freedom of speech. There was going to be less forced labor. People were going to be released from the gulags. Like, tens of thousands of people were released from the gulag. And at first this was done fairly quietly, and eventually it will become something that is more openly known. Pro-Stalinists in the government were ousted. All of this becomes part of a broader policy of de-Stalinization. Khrushchev says to end conditions of insecurity, fear, and even desperation that existed under Stalin's rule. And I think he really believed in the idea of communism, and he really believed in what the Soviet Union was trying to do, and felt like that Stalin's repression, his cult of personality, his dictatorial nature was counter to creating the model nation that Khrushchev really believed in. Or at least that's, one perspective. So Khrushchev's thaw via this de-Stalinization was formalized in a speech he gave to the 20th Communist Congress in 1956, February 1956. And as a result of this secret speech, it was known as at the time, he implements economic reform. He opens up to trade with other nations, which would actually lead to a whole slew of foreign exchanges and cultural influences in the Soviet Union. He would also reach out to leaders like Tito that the Soviet Union had been on bad terms with. He would try and improve his relationship with Mao. He would visit the United States. All of this part of this Khrushchev thaw, which was part of de-Stalinization in his policies. Stalin had arrested nearly 2 million citizens for anti-Soviet activity. Just so you know, most of this stuff was used by fabricated evidence, or confessions were, conducted under torture, and about a third of those people were executed. So a lot of these people are now gaining freedom and being released from prison. Khrushchev goes on to condemn the Great Purge. He condemns the cult of personality and works really hard to undo a lot of the damage that he felt that Stalin had done. Now keep in mind, and we'll discuss this a little bit more later, that he undermines in this the credibility of all of those people who had stood by Stalin for all of those years. And it would create hope for the United States, this idea of opportunity for the United States to believe that peaceful coexistence could exist, but it would disrupt and create instability in the Soviet bloc and weaken the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. So does hope really exist in this setting? You have Eisenhower on the one hand that's at least open to summits, as is Khrushchev, and to top it off, he is this big promoter, at least on paper, of peaceful coexistence. So, is détente possible? Both of these leaders really believe in détente. They believe that with this emerging nuclear arms race, that détente is a necessity unless they are committed to the eradication of humanity. But can they overcome the past? Is there too much damage to undo? How will fear and distrust impact this idea of hope? How will all of the other issues that we talked about before with the nuclear arms race or the developing world and their new independence and the opportunity and fear that it will create for either side, how will these other issues, the unresolved nature of Germany, North Korea's, truce, how will these things be impacted, and how effective will their policies be once they're actually applied?